This is the Mormon Mixed Faith Marriage podcast with certified life coach Brooke Booth, episode number 117. Okay, there's a funny noise outside my window, and I just turned around to see what it was. And there is a whole bunch of wild turkeys out there. So if my dog starts barking, I'm so sorry. Look, you can be watching this on video on YouTube. I think one just strutted past. I live in the suburbs of Detroit, the suburbs of Detroit, but we happen to live in a place that's really wooded, and there are deer and turkeys. We saw a coyote once. I mean, it feels rural, but it's actually rather urban. It's a little bit of a mind bend sometimes. Okay, sounds like my dog's going to be quiet. Let's talk about respect. This podcast is about respect. I know I've talked about this issue in the past, maybe on some of my videos on social media, maybe even here on the podcast. We're doing it again. This is a topic that I think so many of the topics we talk about can be explored from so many different angles. So I'm happy to do that. So we're going to talk about respect. When I went back and looked to the podcast titles, there wasn't one specifically on respect. So I'm like, let's do it. Let's do a specific one. And to be honest, this podcast is for me. Respect is an issue I have in my own mixed faith marriage. So this is a podcast for me and for those of you who may be in a similar situation. I also think this topic of respect is just like a general relationship topic in many regards. I mean, it certainly came up in my marriage a lot after my mixed faith marriage, but I think this can apply in so many relationships. I know for us specifically, this topic came up a lot after the mixed faith marriage. My husband really started to vocalize, how he was feeling a lack of respect and experiencing that in our marriage. And I had a hard time understanding what he was trying to communicate to me at first, because I didn't feel like I was not respecting him. So it took me a while to really unpack this and understand what was going on. I want to share some ideas I have with you here in this podcast. Respect can mean so many different things. And I think how we define it can really impact, the amount of frustration we may have around it. Oftentimes it means stuff like, I want you to act politely, calmly, deferential. If you raise your voice or get animated or passionate or you are emotional, that means you're not showing respect. I want to look at this definition first because I actually think this one's the most problematic. And I want to give you a few reasons why I'm not in love with this particular definition. Under this definition, where respect means to be like polite and calm and deferential and not raise your voice or show a lot of emotion, it can lead to this idea that if you express opposing opinion or a viewpoint with animation, emotion, or passion, then you're not being respectful. And I think that can be problematic. This can cause a spouse to, fit in. I'm referencing a podcast from a few weeks ago where they start to modify who they really are and they start pretending in a relationship. They see that they are not welcome as their passionate, animated, verbose self. And so they water that version of themselves down. And what this can do is it can cause less sharing, less reaching out, less collaboration, less partnership, less knowing. Like, simply put, this creates disconnection and less belonging. Another thing it can do is it sets up a little bit of some rigidity around communication, and that you can only communicate, or we can only have a conversation in very certain narrow, quote unquote, respectful ways, where you need to stay calm, even tempered, even voice, like watch even the volume or modulation of your voice. Sometimes when this happens, you don't really get the full message. You may not realize how important the topic is for your spouse. You may think, "Oh, it's just a difference of opinion. It's not a big deal. It's not very important. Nothing serious is going on," because they're showing up in kind of a calm, regulated way. And it's really hard to distinguish and differentiate things that matter from things that don't matter. And so it's really easy to discount and ignore things that can be actually quite important. When your spouse isn't given room to share the things that really matter in a way that works for them, in a way that is authentic to them. It's interesting too in this because there's kind of like a sense of plausible deniability in this like polite and respectful communication. Like, well, I didn't know that was important to you. It wasn't made clear to me. And I think that can actually be a little bit of a detriment when we police behavior in order to maintain respect. Now, you could probably see how this can happen in a mixed faith marriage. Topics that arise around religion can be really emotionally charged. They can really bring in a lot of like that, like passionate animation. They're important, but when you're not allowed to speak that way because it's quote unquote disrespectful, it can be challenging to communication and it can impact communication. Now, I want to pause here and make a really important like caveat point. I am not saying you have permission to be rude or like an a-hole. Like that's not what I'm saying. Or that you can just like you should just talk without a filter. This is what I'm saying. I'm saying that in our culture, sometimes there is this idea that to be respectful, communication has to be polite, like clinically polite, non-emotional, like where you scrub out the emotion. This can really hobble communication and it can really hobble belonging because somebody has to water down or modify so much who they are in order for them to, participate in the relationship. So this podcast may not apply to everybody. Maybe your relationship is too explosive already. Like not enough filters, too much of that. Skip this episode. This is not for you. This episode is for the people who err on the other side when respect is trying to be created, and so they dismiss all confrontation, all differences of opinion as disrespectful. Where showing up, showing emotion, expressing emotion, especially a negative emotion, is seen as a problem, is looked down on as a bad way to show up in the relationship. That's who I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about in this particular episode. I've seen it with myself and I've seen it with my clients where we're so afraid of being impolite or contentious or mean that we fail to actually communicate or allow our spouse to communicate on important topics. We want so much to be respectful that we forget to be clear. We forget to allow our spouse to communicate in a way that works for them and that is authentic for them. I call this like when you play like a game of chicken. I see my husband and I doing this. Like I call it emotional chicken. Like we're both facing off, and the first one to raise their voice or to show emotion or to break that politeness loses. They lose the moral high ground. They lose face. They lose dignity. Frankly, they lose respect. And that's the irony embedded in this conversation. And what I think this can cause a lot is a lot of loneliness in our marriage. Like if we can't show up as who we are and share what really matters in a way that's authentic to ourselves. Now, again, I am not saying you can be rude or speak without a filter, but when we strip that part of ourselves, this marriage doesn't have room for the individuals. And that's a lonely marriage. Not feeling like you are welcome to share an opinion based on your emotion can be a lonely marriage. Not feeling like you can speak in an animated way where your voice isn't completely always under control, that can be a lonely marriage. Not feeling like you have to always be extremely polite in order to have effective communication, that can be a lonely marriage. Let me give you an example. I like to swear. I really do. This is new since my faith transition. I like to swear when I'm really upset or feeling strongly. And I'm careful. I don't swear like in a demeaning way. I don't swear to about people or directed at people's behavior or personality. I do it to emphasize my point because I think it can just be an effective way of emphasizing one's point. I also sometimes like to increase my volume. I'm not a yeller, but I do like to raise my voice to make a point. And there have been times in my marriage where doing either of these things, and certainly both, was absolutely taboo, prohibited, restricted. If I raised my voice at all as being disrespectful, I would lose that chicken game. Swearing, oh my goodness. Throw in all of your credibility if that were to surface. Now, I'm not slamming my husband here. I mean, he's got his own socialization, his own reasons. Like, I understand them in many, many regards. And he's like, that's his own stuff. But what I'm doing is, as I take care of myself and I look at how I'm not effectively showing up in conversation and in relationship, and how I'm letting respect and that idea diminish my ability to show up in the relationship. That's where I look really closely and get really curious. It was really helpful for me to realize that like swearing or raising my voice wasn't mean or disrespectful. It didn't mean I was bad. And it didn't need to lead to my own internal shame storm. And it gave us an opportunity to talk about respect and what it means and how we can allow ourselves and our spouse to bring their real selves into the relationship. Now, my real self, she's not one to hurt or demean. She's a little spicy at times, but she's not there to attack. And we had to like see that and like acknowledge that about each other and realize that respect didn't always have to mean this really strict version of politeness and neutral tones. So if you're shutting down your partner or getting shut down and you're not able to share in order to be respectful and polite, like what if you could redefine respect? You know, it makes me think when I practice law, this is something you would hear all the time. I'm sure I've said it myself, with all due respect. Like if you're in a courtroom and there's one attorney getting up in front of the judge and says, with all due respect, my opponent's words, blah, 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 or with all due respect, I disagree. It's one of those examples of when you're being extremely polite, but not always respectful. And that's kind of what fascinates me about this conversation is sometimes even when we are being that like super polite, very calm appearing person, we're not actually being respectful. That's why I'm fascinated with this idea of how are you defining respect? And do you need to redefine it in your relationship to be able to communicate more effectively in order to show up and create space for two individuals to be allowed to participate in this relationship in the way that they need to feel honored and heard and respected in the relationship. So what if respect could mean I respect you, so that means I want you to show up in our marriage instead of some version of you that I was taught about how you're supposed to show up or what you were taught about how you were supposed to show up. what if the real true blue you and the real true blue me could show up in this relationship? What if we called that respect? What if respect could mean that sometimes I'm uncomfortable when you show up strong or passionate? And that doesn't need to mean that you're wrong or that you need to be reined in. Now, it might mean I need to explore why this is hard for me and get curious about my own experience and my own triggers and reactions. What if respect could mean that both people are totally welcome in this relationship? The whole of them, all of them, that they don't have to leave parts of themselves at the door of this relationship. What if the goal of creating respect meant seeing the whole self, accepting the whole person, both you and your spouse, knowing that you're two humans, so you're going to be messy and contradictory and imperfect and messy, but letting that be present and okay and welcome in the relationship? What if that's what respect meant? If you struggle feeling respect, showing respect, experiencing respect in your relationship, if your communication's hobbled, your connection, your sense of belonging is hobbled because of how respect is maybe being policed or defined in your relationship, you might need to talk to a coach. You might need to get a little bit of help and see if you can't clean that up and turn that around and create a definition of respect where both people are allowed to be present in that relationship. Now, I'm still saying where there's kindness and goodness, but also just space for our imperfections and our humanity as well. I think under the first definition of respect, sometimes we want a really where we erase part of our humanity and we show up as a partial version of ourselves. Love exploring a definition of respect for the whole person, warts and all, is allowed, welcomed, celebrated in the relationship. Now, I'm going to say this again. I'm really cautious. This doesn't mean that we're given permission to just be jerk faces. That's not what I mean. But I think sometimes we need to give more permission to be, for ourselves and for our spouse, to be who they are. And sometimes that might mean they're emotional. That's okay. Not a problem. That might mean they use swear words or religious terms. And all of this might be how you practice and develop respect, by making room for that and appreciating that and learning how to let that part of them be present in the relationship. Okay, if you want help developing this, reach out. Reach out to me and let's see if my coaching, my one-on-one coaching or my course is a good fit for you. All right, wishing you the very best.